our panel for Think Like a Startup.
Thank you, Pam. So I am personally excited about this panel, and as Pam said, this has been a little bit years in the making because I keep talking about startup companies because I've spent quite a bit of my career, actually 12 years at different startup organizations, and I actually look at Global Genes as a startup, and also the foundation that we started with 5 other families for STXBP1 as a startup. So I'm pretty passionate about this because I think that by thinking of your organization as a startup organization, and John Crowley alluded to some of the kind of key concepts there around innovation, you really have the ability to build a strong foundation quickly and grow. So I'm really delighted to introduce you to our panelists today, and I'll give them, kind of introduce them in turn, and then ask them to talk a little bit about their backgrounds. And so first we have Michael Hurd, who is the CEO of the EB Research Partnership, and Sunitha Malepati, who is the co-founder of CACNA1A and also founder of the Buffalo Initiative. And I'll ask her to share a little bit about both of those. And then Mark Wilhelm, who is a partner at Troutman Pepper. And so today on this panel, what I am hopeful that we can do is really identify some learnings from the startup model and talk about learning fast, so trying things and failing fast and what that feels like, and also what to watch out for, and how to create the right guardrails, if you will, to try to grow in the right way. So why don't we'll ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I'll start with you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Just so we know our room, by a quick show of hands, raise your hand if you represent a rare disease foundation. Awesome. Raise your hand if you represent industry, biotech, fantastic. And how about academics, researchers, clinicians? Wonderful. I just want to thank you, Charlene, and Global Genes for bringing us all together. It was Margaret Mead that said, never doubt that a thoughtful, committed group of citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. And putting people together in a room like this is how we make progress in rare disease. I also want to thank you for bringing us all to Kansas City. I grew up on a cattle ranch an hour west of here, so welcome to Kansas. We're more than just the Wizard of Oz. If you need tips on barbecue and jazz and things to do tonight, I've nominated myself for the unofficial host for all you Kansas people. So find me. We'll be going to the Green Lady Jazz Lounge later. I'll show you guys a little culture. I wanted to thank particularly the parents, Charlene, Sunitha, Mrs. Parker, Anna Rita. I've been in the pediatric disease space for 20 years now, and the fight, the grit, the determination, the resiliency, the innovation that you parents are able to achieve is unlike anything I've ever witnessed before, so thank you for that. I got my start 2 decades ago working for the actors Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward's Camp for Children with Serious Illness, and as an 18-year-old, it changed my life working with pediatric oncology, sickle cell populations, HIV populations, and it made me want to spend a career solving disease, primarily because of the pain and suffering and loss and challenges that I witnessed. Now, if we look back 2 decades ago, look at sickle cell, look at pediatric leukemia, look at HIV/AIDS, the amount of progress and solutions culminating in the first ever gene editing curative treatment approved for sickle cell last year, we're on a rapid trajectory. And so how do we think about that at EB Research Partnership? EB Research Partnership was started 10 years ago by a group of parents that just wanted to save their children's lives. We were lucky to have founders Jill and Eddie Vedder of the band Pearl Jam to elevate that platform. And at that time, it was volunteer-led. There was no research. There wasn't a lot of hope. There wasn't a lot of scientists in the space. And I joined in 2017, and since then we've been able to raise $70 million. We've funded more than 140 projects globally. We've gone from no clinical trials to now more than 40 clinical trials, half of which we've funded as a foundation directly. We've started 8 companies. We've started a technology platform, and I'm proud to say last year was a momentous year. We got not one, but two of the first ever FDA approvals, including one that was the first ever topical gene therapy, a company called Crystal Vizabek, and it was one that we funded under a venture philanthropy model. Every piece of research that we fund is under a venture philanthropy model. Now, these are milestones. We celebrate these milestones, but they're not endpoints. So our mission is to cure this disease by the end of the decade, and in the process, pioneer a model that can impact many other disease foundations.
Thank you. Sunitha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Charlene. Michael, a tough act to follow. Sunitha Malepati is, as Charlene said, Vice President of the CACNA1A Foundation, and also recently started a new initiative that I'll talk about later in the panel called Buffalo Initiative. And I'm also, most importantly, in this space because I have a 7-year-old daughter who has a CACNA1A related disorder, and that's really what brought me to rare disease. My background, I'm an attorney by training and started my career helping private investment funds, both on building funds and finding investors for those funds, but also prior to becoming a lawyer, worked kind of in the social enterprise space and helped build collaborative philanthropy models for community economic development opportunities. And so these threads of my career will come together, I think, as we get further into the questions on today's panel about how we bring the learnings from other spaces into rare to accelerate progress. And right now we're focused at the foundation to hopefully soon start the first ever CACNA1A specific clinical trial and help kids like my daughter reach their fullest potential. Thanks for having me.
Mark.
So I'm Mark Wilhelm. I'm a partner at the law firm of Troutman Pepper. I am based in Philadelphia, but work throughout the country. I focus my practice on corporate and securities work, so everything from startups to mature companies. And I think this was coincidental. I don't think there was any planning, but I actually serve as outside counsel to Amicus Therapeutics, John Crowley's company. So I've been working with them for 10 years, my entire career, just sort of happy coincidence. And unlike these guys who are in it every day, my role is to just help all of you, right, to advance the mission. There are certainly things that I can talk about places where things go wrong, things that we need to look out for. But I look at everybody in the room, I hear you guys' stories, and to me, I'm just the paper pusher of the group.
Well, I hardly think that's the case. Having been in many different organizations, there's such a critical role for many skill sets, and so I think that we hopefully collectively across this panel can talk about those critical skill sets. So for those of you who don't know, I live in San Francisco, the heart of Silicon Valley, and so I have spent a lot of my career in small companies, and there's the lore, right, with startups around starting in the garage and all of that, and there is truth to that in many situations, or now like starting in people's living rooms, if you will. But we had talked about preparing for this panel kind of 3 stages of development. The virtual garage, when you're really just getting your organization started, and then when you've actually have your first office, and that may be for the reality for a lot of us in terms of these patient-started organizations. It may be like in your living room, but you actually have a desk before you did it, and then what it looks like to be scaling. And so wanted to start out with the virtual garage, and Sunitha, I was hoping you could start us off. Tell us about what that experience was like with CACNA1A.
Yeah, sure. So the CACNA1A Foundation was started in 2020, so right at the start of the pandemic. And it was started by a group of families who have found each other on social media. So CACNA1A is a rare neurological disorder. Our kids have seizures, they have intellectual disability, they have global developmental delays. A lot of the stuff we heard in the FOXP1 community also impact our CACNA1A kiddos. And I think John's story about receiving the diagnosis really resonated with me, because you get this diagnosis and you're in some ways actually relieved to get a diagnosis, because we had been searching for an answer to explain the things we were seeing in our child, and so many of our families do. And when you get the diagnosis, you want to understand what are the next steps, like what can we do? And for almost all of us, there's nothing that we can do. And being just with the background that I have, and maybe just a whole sense of like, if there's nothing out there, we've got to make this happen. We gathered with other families and we said, we're going to create an organization that is focused on accelerating research with the goal of actually getting treatments to these kids in their lifetime. And that is the goal of the foundation. So we, with that sort of laser focus on getting to treatments that improve the quality of life of these kids, we did everything we could to learn from folks like Charlene and other organizations that had started before us. And I think that was one of the things that was so easy to do during a pandemic, when people were willing to talk to anyone all the time because everyone was at home and there was Zoom, and for so many reasons it was fortuitous that we started during a pandemic. And as I think most of you know in this room, everyone's willing to talk to you if you're starting an organization, and they're willing to tell you what they did that worked and what didn't work. And I just did not want to reinvent the wheel. We didn't have time to waste, and we didn't need to go down paths other people had already tried and said didn't work. And so we really gathered intelligence, especially in the neurodevelopmental community, from our other monogenic conditions, and we followed kind of roadmaps other people had built. And so in 4 years, so since 2020, we have stood up our own natural history study. We were lucky to get a grant from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to hire our first science director. We have built a biobanking program through our partnership with Combined Brain. We've built our own mouse models through grants from the Orphan Disease Center. We've started disease concept models. I mean, we, in short order, just started building things that didn't exist in the field. And then I think one of the most important things that we also did is we decided that we were going to adopt a collaborative model, and we brought everyone to the table. So over the past 2 years, we've built a 60-person collaborative research network with researchers and clinicians all over the world, and we set the agenda as the patient organization. And the agenda is what matters to our families. And it's unbelievable to have a room full of clinicians and researchers who have been studying this disease since the 90s, have a different mission, one that's aligned with our families, because we bring the families' stories and lived experience to their work. They go back to their labs and their clinics with a different perspective. And then we incentivize them as well, right? We help them get additional grant dollars. We help them by giving them research assets. And we've just created a different way to go about doing this sort of scientific endeavor that is centered around the things that matter to us. And it's been an incredible 4 years, and I think we're still in the garage, quite frankly, but maybe starting to get to the driveway, or I don't know what the next stage is in between this and a professional office, but a lot of lessons learned and a lot of progress that it's possible to really start really with a core mission that matters to your community and actually drive real progress.
So Sunitha, you said mission 3 times, and I think that is something I want to just really underscore, which is when you got together with the families and the leaders who ended up being the founding leaders or founding families of the organization, you said that accelerating research was your goal. And I think that's so important because there are many reasons to start a foundation associated with a particular disorder. And one of the lessons for me, also in my daughter's foundation, but in previous companies also, was making sure that everybody knows what the mission is and is aligned around the mission is critical, because otherwise people are trying to do different things. So I think that's a really important kind of lesson from what you're talking about. Thank you. So virtual garage. So now let's talk about the first office. And Michael, you talked about an incredible trajectory that EB Research Partnership and epidermis bullosa has been on over the last few years. But when you started, at the organization, it was really kind of at the beginning of that, prior to that kind of scaling. And so talk about that. Like, what does professionalization start to look like? And what are the key ingredients?
Absolutely. I mean, Sunitha, it really drove this home, right? So epidermolysis bullosa, EB, for short, those with EB are called butterfly children because the skin is as fragile as the wings of a butterfly. So every day, hours of bandaging, bleach baths, 30 different medical specialists. So for us, whether you're in the garage, whether you're in the office, whatever stage, never losing that urgency, right? As parents, and all the parents, including you both in this room, know that, right? You want to keep that urgency, that fight, that determination, that drive, and that embodies a startup mentality, right? And when I came on board the organization, 7 years is kind of a short time, right? We didn't have any full-time staff members. We had 33 board members that were running the organization, which is really hard to govern 33 board members. We would raise $1 million or $2 a year, right? So we've grown really fast, and I'll talk about that briefly, but for everybody in the room, whatever stage you are at running a foundation, I'd like to offer a framework of 3 pillars. So number 1, build data platforms. Number 2, build collaborative networks. And number 3, build innovative investment models, right? When it comes to nonprofit, my mentor, Kathy Giusti from the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, always said 501c3 is a tax status. That is not a business model. And as leaders that approach foundation work, we need to aspire to run companies like foundations, like Fortune 50 companies. We need to aspire to that level. Mm-hmm. And we break down this framework. What does building a data platform look like? Data drives decisions. Out here in Kansas, we say, how do you get the horse to come to water? Well, whether it's a biotech company, whether it's an academic medical center, whether it's a clinician or research, data is that water that we need to lead the community to. So natural history studies you mentioned, but even thinking about how can we build sophisticated data platforms that contemplate the advent of AI and machine learning. Now, we all say that, right? But if we are not thinking about this as foundations, regardless of what size or scale you're at right now, it would be the equivalent of 20 years ago and saying, I'll never need a website, or I'll never need this internet thing. We have to build platforms that can anticipate, scale, and be open source to an advent of a really disruptive technology in AI and machine learning. We've built a platform called Curator along with Amazon Web Services and Stanford University, and it's really powered by at-home genomics, making it simple, led by patients and families, driven by patients and families, and letting them have control and say over where their data is seen and used. So get genomics, they decide where they want to share that with clinicians, researchers, or biotech and pharma industry, and curating their journey with the disease, taking something that's complicated and driving it with good UX, which we don't say a lot in healthcare technology, and good design. Number 2, collaborative networks. I will never be the one that sits up here and knocks academic medical centers. They're wonderful. We need them. They're so important in our work. But they work inside an ecosystem that makes it very difficult for them to share data with other universities, even back to patients and families with foundations. So creating collaborative networks and contemplating how can we leverage our funding, whether it's your first $25,000 grant or whether it's a $2.5 million grant, tying conditions to that, which we started to do 7 years ago when I joined. Yes, we will fund you and provide funding for your work under the condition that you share this with our collaborative network of academics, researchers, and think about how this can benefit industry. How can this promote clinical trials? How can this attract biotech investment? And then the final pillar, number 3, is innovative investment models. For us, that's been venture philanthropy. We don't put a penny out the door without a venture philanthropy agreement in place. Now, we didn't invent it. I would give cystic fibrosis and others credit for that, but I would argue that we've pioneered institutionalizing it. We just do not spend a penny on research or a company unless it's under a venture philanthropy model. And put quite simply, and happy to talk with others more about it, it just means that our dollars are tied to an equity stake in a university and a company. So if that's commercially successful, return comes back to our foundation to fund more research until we cure the disease. In Crystal Biotech, the first approval last year, the first ever topical gene therapy, we invested a little over $800,000, took an equity stake, we more than doubled our investment, and that's scaling. That means that we took a donor's dollar and we turned it into $2. That means we don't have to always rely on donation drives and galas, that you're creating other revenue sources. So thinking about your end-to-end business model. So I would offer those 3 pillars. as a start. And you know, the other things to sort of think about are your tools, your board, your technology. Your
And
staff.
yes, and actually that's one thing I wanted to go back to. So you came in as the first employee and you had 33 bosses.
That's right. Yeah, that's
So you know, that's a journey, and I think that it's a real challenge for small organizations that have been led by, you know, a founding set of families who have, you know, have this, you know, clear mission around making a difference for their community, and now they want to bring in somebody who is professionalizing the organization, right? Talk about a little bit about that transition.
For all of us, again, whether you're just starting or a large foundation, professionalization, Charlene, is exactly the right word. So the first place I looked was the board. It's not professional to have 33 board members, and most nonprofits go through this cycle, right? This family has helped run an event. Let's throw them on the board. This person gave us our first big donation. Let's throw them on the board, right? And you do that for a few years, and all of a sudden you look around and you have 33 bosses, right? So I really challenged our board to think about this in the same way that you would build a startup and a team. Do we have a legal expert? Do we have a finance expert? Making sure that we have patient families and voices on this board. Do we have a technology expert on this team? Do we have a medical expert on this team? So rather than just, this is an open tent, everybody come here, really building a team in the same way that you build a company, and that starts with the board of directors. So you really have to do that. And then turning your eyes, the same thing with the staff. I mean, there's great, if anybody's ever seen the Dan Pelota, the way that we think about nonprofits is dead wrong, right? I mean, his theory is, do we love our iPhones? Do we love our cars? Does anybody say to Apple and Tesla, you should hire the cheapest staff possible, not pay them well and give them raises and burn them out, right? Like, that's not the way it should work. So I also took an approach that the first hire was maybe a little more salary-wise than a nonprofit would be able to hire, but I wanted to draw people from industry. We hired a chief marketing officer from JP Morgan. You know, we hired staff from LinkedIn, and, you know, they did double or triple the amount of work that maybe somebody without that expertise would do. So once you professionalize the board, trying to find the best possible people, making that investment for your first hire that may be a little more in salary, but I guarantee you they'll do 5, 10, 20x by getting the right people on board with the organization.
So Mark, I'm trying to figure out a way to say this kindly. For people who have never started an organization before, and you know, there's a lot already. Just getting a 501c3 filed and all of that is a big deal. And you know, you start out with your mission, and you know, get your shiny 501c3, or you're in the process of getting your 501c3, and there's so much you want to do. And a lot of people have not had, you know, experience with giving grants, with, you know, dealing with anything around IP, things like that. So I think my question to you is what are the things that you know, in these early stages, and, you know, in this stage when we're starting to professionalize, what are the things that really matter, where you need to say, I definitely need to make sure that I have counsel, or that I, you know, have put on guardrails? What are the things that matter?
Sure. So one of the things that Michael talked about, he used the word urgency a lot. And I totally understand that. When you're starting a company, when you're starting a foundation, there is a mission, it is urgent, it is important to you. But a lot of times what happens is you trade urgency for getting things right, or the details, right? Because it's not important. What's important is the mission, and we advance it as quickly as possible, and we'll figure out all of the other stuff later. And a lot of lawyers will tell you, we have to get everything right, all the I's have to be crossed, all the T's dotted, all the T's have to be crossed. I'm going to tell you that's not exactly the case. There's some stuff that matters, there's some stuff that doesn't matter. And when we're thinking about it as lawyers, it's useful to have somebody who sort of knows what matters and what doesn't matter to hold your hand through that. We had talked before about coming up with examples. My mom is the greatest example of this. My mom is not a lawyer. She's not legally trained. And when I was a kid, we would have permission slips that our parents would have to sign for us to go on field trips at school. And the permission slips we had at my school were something that had been copied 1,000 times, and, you know, they had like the grayscale to it because it had been copied so much. And my mom would sit there with her glasses pulled down, like trying to read every word of this like 2 or 3 page permission slip. And when I had gone to law school, became a lawyer, I thought about that for some reason. And I said, Mom, why did you read that permission slip? And it was the exact same one every single time. You could tell because it was photocopied. And she said, well, I need to know what it says. It's really important that I read this and I know what it says. And I said, well, would you have known if anything was wrong? And she said, no, how would I know? I'm not a lawyer, right? But she had that mentality of she read it, she thought she was understanding it, but the reality is that she could have seen or read the words that from a legal perspective could have been very bad. She would have no idea. I think that for companies who are just starting out, it's sort of the same thing, where from my perspective, there are two really important things that people need to focus on: capitalization and intellectual property. Capitalization just being who owns the company. In the nonprofit context, that's not exactly right because there isn't really ownership in the way there would be in a for-profit model. But I think that for folks in this room, knowing how your intellectual property works, knowing where you have rights, where you might be giving away rights is critically important. Because when you have that urgent mindset, you're trading flexibility down the road for saying yes immediately. And I think that the concern of folks should be losing that flexibility down the road. And just as a very quick example in that IP context, if you're licensing intellectual property to someone, there's going to be a bunch of legal words in a row right in front of the license. It's going to say it's a hopefully non-exclusive, worldwide, fully paid up, a bunch of other terms in that line. To the example with my mom, if my mom was starting a foundation, if she was licensing intellectual property, she wouldn't know which of those words should or shouldn't be there. And something as simple as exclusive versus non-exclusive could mean everything to an organization 10 years down the road. And so I think it's, especially when you're hitting things related to intellectual property, find someone who's fluent in that language, who understands how that works, so that you can avoid making those mistakes that might harm you down the road.
Yeah. So talking about scaling, and Michael talked a little bit about how fundraising for them has changed. Sunitha, I wanted to ask you to talk about fundraising. What does that look like? And if you can start actually a little bit earlier than scaling and talk about kind of the journey that you've been on, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I think fundraising is, it's, I think, the heart of what we're trying to do to power this work. And often, I think in the sort of startup context, you think about sort of family and friends, providing the initial capital. And that's exactly how it is, I think, for most patient foundations. It's the patients' families that, and who are directly impacted by the disease that are giving you those often small dollar amounts in the beginning until they figure out if this is really worth their dollar. And so that's how the CACNA1A Foundation started, with capital from primarily in the beginning the initial founding families. And then as we sort of gained the trust of the community, those dollars started coming in from the community themselves. I think the key for us is making sure that we deployed those dollars that came in a way that built our credibility and reputation within the community, that we were actually going to do something meaningful with the dollars they put into the foundation. And so we were very lean. We didn't have any paid staff at the time, and we really wanted to make sure those dollars went primarily to research in the beginning, so that there was some sense of hope that the work that we were going to do, or we were going to put money into, was going to really make a difference for the community. I think at the end of the day, one of the lessons I've learned just over the past 4 years is you really need to have a major donor strategy fairly early on. I think relying on sort of these individual grassroots small donor amounts is great, but it's not going to be able to, it's not going to enable you to have the impact that you want to have, especially in an endeavor like as expensive as research and biomedical innovation. And so having a major donor strategy and figuring out how to tap into that is really important. And I think, as most of you know who have been in this space, there aren't actually many philanthropic opportunities here from institutional foundations or grant-making organizations in this space. I mentioned Chan Zuckerberg Initiative at the beginning. They're one of the only entities out there that are funding patient organizations that are working in the rare disease space. And that's why, I don't know if you want to talk about this now or later, but that's why I'm starting another initiative that's really the heart of the initiative is based on the problems I was seeing in the funding space for CACNA1A. If you don't have sort of a wealthy family connected to the disease or to someone in the friends and family network of your community, it's really difficult to get those big dollars in to fund the work that you're trying to do. And I thought a lot about this problem in the context of how do we make ourselves as a disease appealing to philanthropies? Because at the end of the day, like, a lot of these philanthropies are big, they're focused on sort of big ideas, big problems. And when you start with the fact that you're trying to solve a rare disease, most people can't even pronounce CACNA1A, that's not going to get big dollars in the door from people who aren't connected to the community. And so I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of building a philanthropic network, a collaborative funding model for rare diseases through this new initiative called the Buffalo Initiative, which we can talk about in detail later. But I think primarily really thinking really creatively about additional revenue streams. So we talked about sort of fundraising from donations, and Michael talked about sort of monetizing some of your assets, which is why it's so important you don't give up control of those assets. You have to think about your organization as a business that has multiple potential revenue streams. And if you set yourself up to be able to capitalize on those revenue streams because of the assets you own and have control over, you're going to be much better off than just solely relying on a sort of donation-based model.
Yeah, and I think words are so important because in a nonprofit context, kind of thinking of things like I'm building an asset, you know, that's such a commercial term, but I think that it's critical to be thinking of it that way and thinking of, you know, basically what is the portfolio that I'm creating, not only, and I think in the early stages, we keep thinking of it like, this is the way that I'm going to be able to attract researchers, right? This is the way that I'm going to be able to attract biopharma, but it's not to give it all away necessarily, right? And trying to kind of navigate that, I think, is important. The other thing that I heard you talking about also was this, you know, not necessarily transition, but like this expansion from small donations to, you know, to large donors. And I think that that's also a really important thing because it's exhausting to, you know, run the X number of golf tournaments and the, you know, the running events and all of that. Like, those are so important, you know, so I'm not saying that people shouldn't do them because they build community. They're, you know, very vital for many reasons. But, you know, when we started, you know, looking at the dollars that we needed to raise, you know, our first grant that we gave was $75,000, you know, and now we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars per grant. Like, it's you can't do that with a bake sale. Yeah. And I do want to get to Buffalo Initiative, but I wanted to talk a little bit about effective leadership and, you know, what that looks like. And Mark, I wanted to start with you, like from an outsider perspective, because, you know, when you were talking earlier about your, you know, the example of your mom and the permission slip. So what are the, you know, like from a decision-making standpoint, especially when, you know, I'm a nonprofit entrepreneur, and these are issues that I have not, you know, kind of encountered before. I haven't, you know, walked this path before. What are the things that should be kind of like flags to me that, you know, like that I, you know, should be consulting with somebody about risks? Like, what are the, you know, I know that IP is a huge one. Are there other areas where you think that people really need to be mindful, you know, extra mindful, I would say, from a decision-making standpoint?
Sure. So I think that the most effective leaders of organizations, from my perspective, are people who are willing to take risks. Notwithstanding everything I just said about not taking risks, that's what like makes a good leader. And if you're talking to a lawyer, our entire job is minimizing risk. I hate risk. I hate everything about it. I'm not someone who's ever going to skydive. Like, that's just not me. But there are plenty of people who will and do, and those are effective top executive officer, like that sort of role in organization people. And so I want to qualify everything I say by that. I think that for any given person who's starting a company, starting a foundation, and who's looking and saying, I don't know, like I don't even know what I don't know. I think the most important thing is to find someone who does. That can be a lawyer, it can be someone who's done it before. There's no magic in having a lawyer do this. But it's someone who you can go to and just ask advice, right? Because otherwise, you're not going to necessarily see where the issues are that you should even be concerned about. I think that from a more nuts and bolts standpoint, anytime that someone puts a piece of paper in front of you and says, sign this, you want to understand what's on that piece of paper. And I use the example of my mom with the waiver. Another example that we see all the time is I'll be working with small businesses and they'll hand us a contract and they'll say, would you just review this really quickly? Just spend a couple minutes on it. And they said, I looked at it and it looks totally fine to me. And I read through it and I say, well, it says here that there's a most favored nation provision. That looked okay to you? And they say, yeah, that's fine. I said, well, do you know what that term means? And they say, no, never heard of it before. Very quick summary. It means that if you're giving pricing to someone, that they get the best pricing of any customer that you'll ever have. So if you give a lower price to a different customer, the person you signed a contract with gets that same price. That can be devastating for a company. And provisions like that get slipped into agreements all the time. And people will just say, oh, looks good to me. I think that the big picture takeaway from that is if there's something in a document, if there's something that someone's asking you, whether it's legal or not, that you don't know exactly what that means, find someone who does. Because I think those are the places where companies really get in trouble is when they're doing things, again, trying to be urgent, but giving up that flexibility down the road.
Yeah, I agree. And, another clause that I think is important for people to understand is really around liability. And, the language and contracts there can be very vague, so it's not really clear the full responsibility that, you might be assuming. And so that one's, I think, an important one as well.
Yeah, and I mean, for us lawyers, there's a whole list of provisions that concern me, right? But I think that at the very basic, as someone who, may not want to hire a lawyer at first, but let's be serious, lawyers are expensive and no one gets excited about paying lawyers. Like, I understand that. And so I think the takeaway is if there's language in that agreement where you don't know what wrong would look like, you should probably talk to someone about whether it's wrong.
I think that's great, what wrong would look like. Yeah, that's a good way to think of it. So Sunitha, as a parent, in terms of effective leadership, so urgency is a great, motivator, but can you talk a little bit about how that helps and also kind of hinders foundation leaders?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And I think it dovetails exactly what you were just talking about, Mark. So I think in the beginning, right, you're trying to move as quickly as possible. You have someone in your home that is literally living the effects of the disease you're trying to find a treatment for. So it's very real and in your face kind of all of the time. And then you start to meet other families who are going through even sort of more challenging situations. And the mission is just so clear and in your face all of the time. But I think at the same time, understanding that this journey is actually, it's longer than we all want it to be to get to those treatments, and can be sort of severely interrupted or potentially devastatingly dropped because you made some critical early mistakes in some of these agreements, some of these partnerships, some of the ways you built kind of assets can really hinder your ultimate goal, right? And so you have to really temper that urgency with getting things right. And I think you're exactly right. It doesn't always have to be a leader or a lawyer. I think we've learned a lot from other organizations, honestly, sharing, different provisions that they've used. And I think a lot of PAG leaders have talked about just sharing legal resources and templates and frameworks, and you have to be careful with that stuff too. But I think at the end of the day, like, you really want to make sure that you have the important things right while you're trying to move fast so you don't sort of jeopardize your ultimate mission. And it can be really hard to balance that, but it's really, really important.
Well, let's talk about failures. I think that, so one of the things I want to say about failing is that we're all going to fail. So I actually look at failing, and again, like adopting my startup mentality, that it's through failing that we learn lessons. And, like if we don't try something, we don't even get the opportunity to either succeed or fail. But I'd love to hear from this group around, lessons learned that you've had. And, Michael, you talked a little bit about the venture philanthropy model that y'all have implemented, in the last, 7 years. And, so what are the, now you have a more mature model, but what are the lessons learned that you have from implementing venture philanthropy at UB?
Yeah, and to Mark's point, great leadership is taking risks, and the outcome of taking those risks are, if it works, let's double down on it and do more of it. If it doesn't, let's learn from it, pivot. That's true startup mentality, right? So for us, necessity is the mother of invention, right? And all of our innovations have been really born from failures, and then deciding, let's dust ourselves off, let's get back up and decide what we're going to do about it. So for example, venture philanthropy. Early on, the foundation had made their biggest investment ever in a therapeutic for EB, and didn't take an equity stake, didn't negotiate a venture philanthropy agreement. A few years later, number one, it was sold to a household name biotech and pharma company for hundreds of millions of dollars. And here these parents are sitting and saying, wait a minute, like we invested in that, we funded that, somebody's putting that hundreds of millions of dollars in their pocket, and it's not us. We should prevent that in the future. Second, it went to a big company, and it sat on the shelf for 8 years while patients and families passed away and suffered and died. And now the families are sitting there saying, we funded this, we didn't get any economics, and we have no say over the fact that this has been deprioritized within this company. So from that, and everybody get yourself a mark, we worked with good counsel to say, how can we prevent that in the future? Well, we're always going to take an equity stake and an equity position to prevent that. And we're always going to have controls. That's the two components of venture capital, economics and control. We're always going to have controls that say, if you sit on this for a period of time, we're going to be able to march in, pull this out, and take it forward on our own. Now, the other thing that I would advise, and this goes into the grit and resiliency and termination, I've done over 100 venture philanthropy contracts. Almost every single one has started with a, no, we don't do that, right? So if anybody in the world knows to not give up and not take no for an answer, it's parents and families in the rare disease community. So I just want to let you know, try, and try again. And there's innovations that we learn specifically on IP rights for universities. If you want monetization and an equity stake in university IP, even if you get all the way to the dean, it just ain't going to happen, right? So, okay, how can we do that? We decided that we're going to take a commercialization stake when that IP is commercialized and take an equity percentage of that rather than the IP itself. Okay, we can do that. We can work with that. So there was an innovation born out of adaptation. The other thing I'll say to families, it's really hard, right? Maybe there's 3 researchers out there that are working on your disease group. So early on, you think, we got to do anything we can to make this work. I would challenge that a little bit. And I would actually be willing to walk away, which we've done often. Here's our capital. We want a venture philanthropy agreement. If you're not willing to do it, we're willing to walk away. And that changes the tide pretty quick. I've got calls from those deans and those university heads that say, wait a minute. And that's leverage for those in the rare disease community, because often there's no capital. The absence of capital gives you leverage to negotiate really good deals. The last thing I'll say on mistakes and learning, and I could write a book on failures and mistakes and what we've learned and how we've pivoted data. When I arrived at the organization, we had funded a university consortium of 20 academic medical centers, and we funded a data project for 7 years. We put a significant amount of capital in. I came on as CEO, and as everybody, as leaders should, ask a lot of questions. And I said, well, look, how can this data be used for biotech and pharma companies to advance clinical trials? Well, it really can't. How can this data be shared back in real time to patients and families to inform their journey with disease today? Well, it really can't. We want to wait 7 years to publish it. How can this data be shared back with the foundation to do analytics and machine learning and AI? It's not really what it was built for. That's a problem. We probably wasted 7 years, so we decided we're going to start our own technology platform where we solve each of those issues and we learn from mistakes. So being comfortable with failing, being excited in some ways to fail, as long as you take those learnings and adapt as an organization and inform your strategy moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, the issue around what you can do with data and data, ownership is such a critical thing, and it's a challenge in each disease area. Obviously that's one of the reasons that RareX was started, but I think that this idea also where EB Research Partnership had funded that consortium, I think, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I hear this over and over again that, and this goes back to rights where, it's not a therapeutic asset, right, that's being developed, but it's data. And I think that it's unintuitive sometimes for people to understand that even though it's the patients who are contributing the data, somehow they're in an agreement or they've given a grant to an organization and there are no rights to be able to leverage that data. And so that's something I think fundamentally is such a critical thing to watch out for.
You raised a good point, and one quick one. Don't make the mistake of trying to be everything for your community. There is too much redundancy in rare disease, and we in this room need to commit to fixing that. You don't have to do advocacy, funding research, science, data platforms. There's groups like Charlene and Global Genes. We've got Michelle here from Bio. You've got Every Life. These groups have expertise to advocate and solve for the rare disease community. Don't try to do it all. Do the market analysis like you would starting any business or startup. See where you fit into that and double down and hammer home your area of expertise and work with partners where they've spent many, many years establishing those inroads.
Yeah. Sunitha, so CACNA1A has been on this rocket ship trajectory, since 2020, and but I'm sure that there are some, lessons learned of, things that you would have done differently. You want to share anything?
Yeah, I think that I'm not going to sort of go deeper on the control issue, but I think that is one of the biggest lessons I've just learned. I know people talk about control, but you don't really know what it means till you try to actually utilize some of the assets that you've developed or funded, and you just can't. Like, you run into these roadblocks because you didn't negotiate enough control. So that was a huge lesson. And I think the second sort of biggest lesson I'm learning now is as we're starting to see interest from biopharma, is the questions they're asking are not necessarily the questions we were asking ourselves when we built these data platforms or started collecting data. So we don't have, we've spent 4 years collecting data, but there are certain data points we have not collected any data on, and I didn't even know that that was important data for a company to know about until they sort of are looking at us as a BD opportunity. And so I think when you're building these sort of whether any sort of data collection program within your community, to not only ask your community what are the important questions that are important, and not only ask the community and the researchers you're working with what are the important questions, but talk to folks that are really actually doing drug development. What would they need to know about our community? And so when they are at some point there is interest from those companies, you actually have the data you need to take those partnerships forward and to be fruitful. So you're not starting from scratch 5 years in, which for some of these data points we are now going to have to start collecting brand new data.
Yeah, it's true. It was very illuminating to me that someone from a biotech company kind of shared their BD evaluation process. And I think you may have been in the same meeting, but just to understand, these are the things, these are the 20 things or 30 things that they are looking at, and understanding it from the other side versus the patient advocacy side, and really trying to do that earlier. Absolutely. Mark, since you work with a lot of organizations, any lessons learned that we haven't talked about already?
Yeah, so actually, something that Michael said made me think of a point. Nobody ever goes into a relationship thinking that it's going to go badly, right? No client has ever come to me and said, I have this great opportunity, we're going to do something, and it is going to end terribly, we're going to hate each other at the end, and that doesn't happen, right? And so I think what's important for anybody who's thinking about entering into some sort of relationship, taking one of those risks, is ask yourself, what can go bad? So what would happen 3, 5, 7 years down the road, that if that event happened, I would be upset and unhappy. And how do we put guardrails around that? To your point, if it's shelving some technology, maybe you take an equity interest, maybe it's that you have control rights over if that's not being developed. Those are certainly things that you can do. But I think it's important for you to ask yourself, what are those bad things that could happen, and what can I do today to make sure that they don't happen, or if they do happen, that I'm protected? And
maybe, can you talk about, since we were talking about biotech and biopharma interest, can you talk about that in terms of, of course, everybody is all rosy-eyed when they are starting to talk to a potential partner, but I think that especially when you have a patient advocacy organization and you have a biotech and pharma, there can be, even though there's a desire to work together, they don't necessarily have the same motivation. So can you talk a little bit about that, about why that might be so, and what are the ways to kind of get to on the same page?
Sure. So I think maybe it's obvious that the motivations aren't the same, right? So if you're a foundation who you just want someone's disease cured, that's your goal, right? It isn't about making a bunch of money and developing and commercializing. That's not it. If you go to someone who's a large biotech, like maybe that is. And so each person comes to the table with their different motivations. One of the things that I've taken from some of our clients is starting to ask the question at the very beginning, so what is it that you want? What is success to you? And thinking about building the relationship in that context. Because a lot of times when we're negotiating agreements, what will happen is the lawyers will get on the phone, and if I'm representing a seller or a licensor, I'll have my sort of pre-stock position, right? That I always take in every contract. And the lawyer on the other side will have the same, or an opposite position on the same point that they always take in every contract, and we just fight about it. But the reality is that our clients are coming to this from a more commercial or mission perspective, right? Where they don't necessarily care what the normal thing is. They care about what it is to them. And so I think what's important is for you to communicate with whoever your commercial partner is, here's what I'm trying to get out of this relationship, here's what my goal is, and understand theirs as well. Most of the times, those aren't actually opposed. It's just finding a way to achieve those aims that's different than what we would typically do.
Kind of like finding the Venn diagram, right? The overlap.
Yeah.
So I want to circle around, and I know that we're in our last few minutes here, and since we've been talking about innovation and also a lot of innovation and funding, you've alluded to the Buffalo Initiative, Sunitha. Can you share a little bit about what that organization is doing and how you see it really breaking the mold of and frankly breaking this challenging impasse that we've had in advocacy around significant dollars hopefully coming into fuel research?
Yeah, and I'll just put in a plug for the Innovative Financing Panel on Friday or tomorrow. I'll talk actually exclusively about the Buffalo Initiative there, so you can come hear more about it there. But in short, it's essentially a new organization we're just starting up right now, and it's building on what I helped run prior to going to law school it was called Living Cities. It's still around, but it was the largest philanthropic collaborative, 22 of the largest foundations and financial institutions that all pooled capital to work on investing in community economic development opportunities. And what we're trying to do right now with the Buffalo Initiative is build a similar funding collaborative, so bringing together philanthropies that are already investing kind of in science and clinical research, but are not actually doing it in a community-driven way. So how do we accelerate breakthroughs that communities want to happen through their own work and fund them to do that work in the place they're getting stuck? So I think you've probably heard the term Valley of Death. It's the phase between a promising preclinical candidate and getting through IND or investigational new drug application to start a phase 1, phase 2 clinical trial. What we're doing is building an impact investing fund to invest in community-led drug development in that space, to help people get through those IND-enabling studies. And we're going to build an entire wraparound bullpen of technical, regulatory expertise to help community-led or patient advocacy-led groups actually drive progress in that Valley of Death space. And then we're going to build some knowledge platforms to actually enable other patient advocates who are coming up behind them to traverse this valley of death much more easily than we've been able to, at least to date. And so we're hoping that this is a successful model that can be sort of replicated and scaled, quite frankly, for all rare diseases. But right now we're focusing on neurological.
That's great. Well, some more about that tomorrow, and hopefully we can turn that valley of death into a really thriving valley. So I know we are at the end of our time. We don't have time. We do have time for one question, or no, we don't have. Okay. We're getting the, well, thank you all so much. This was really, really wonderful.